Do not close your eyes, Thomas. You must look at me. The towering woman clutched the small, shivering boy to her broad chest. Her massive legs drove through the blinding, freezing rain of the Rocky Mountain Pass. The storm was tearing the world apart, but Rowena knew the real danger was the wealthy family hunting them from behind. What would a mother sacrifice to protect the only soul who ever looked at her without fear? Stay until the end of this memory to find out. Please like and comment where you are watching from today so we can see how far this story travels. The truth of Rowena and her desperate flight is a heavy tale, far more complicated than anyone in that mountain town could have ever imagined. The freezing mud sucked at her heavy leather boots. Her lungs burned with every icy breath. She had walked for 3 days, fleeing the wealthy estate of the family belonging to her late husband. They wanted to take Thomas away forever. They called her a beast, a savage monster, entirely unfit for motherhood, due to her massive size and calloused hands. A flicker of warm, golden light cut through the black sheets of rain. It was a solitary timber mill standing defiant against the edge of the wilderness. Rowena pushed her powerful frame up the muddy embankment. She hammered her massive fist against the heavy oak door. The timber door swung inward. A colossal man filled the frame. Gideon stood like a mountain of weathered stone. Broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and a thick, dark beard, he possessed the rugged, quiet strength of a man who had spent his life swinging heavy axes in the silent woods. His sharp, observant eyes flicked from the towering, wildly muscular woman to the tiny, freezing boy trembling in her arms. He did not ask questions. Get inside before the wind takes the boy. The deep gravel of his voice rumbled through the howling storm. Rowena stumbled across the threshold. The warmth of a roaring hearth washed over her shivering skin. She gently set Thomas down upon a large bearskin rug near the cracking fire. Before she could speak her gratitude, a horrific crack echoed from the yard outside. The heavy iron hinges of the main timber barn were tearing loose. The panicked screams of draft horses pierced the heavy rain. Gideon bolted through the open cabin door, rushing out into the chaotic darkness. Rowena did not hesitate. She looked at her safe, sleeping child, then turned and ran right back into the storm. Through the driving rain, Gideon strained against the massive wooden barn door. The wind acted as a solid wall of force, pushing the heavy timber backward. Even with his immense strength, his thick boots slid through the slick mud. The door was buckling. The horses inside were terrified. Suddenly, a large, calloused pair of hands slammed against the rough wood beside his own. Gideon glanced sideways in shock. Rowena planted her heavy boots deep into the muddy earth. The soaked fabric of her dark red dress clung to her massive, heavily developed thighs as she dropped her center of gravity. The thick, rolling muscles of her broad back and shoulders flared with pure, raw power. She let out a deep, guttural breath. Together, the two giants pushed. The sheer physical dominance of the towering woman matched the silent Timberman pound for pound. Her massive biceps bulged, locking into place as the heavy door groaned, moving forward inch by inch against the violent gale. With a final explosive surge of strength, they slammed the heavy timbers shut. Gideon threw the iron latch into place. They stood in the freezing rain, chests heaving, staring at one another. The stoic protector of the mountain had never seen a woman possess such breathtaking, undeniable physical power. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet, profound respect. They returned to the cabin in silence. Gideon barred the door against the wind. He brought forward thick woolen blankets, handing them to the giant woman. Water dripped from her wild, messy blonde hair. She wrapped the wool tightly around her trembling son. "You have my thanks." Her voice was a soft, gentle melody, forming a striking contrast to her rugged, imposing exterior. "We will not stay long. We must keep moving by dawn." Gideon stepped back into the shadows of the room. He watched the way her massive, calloused hands touched the small boy with absolute, delicate reverence. "You are safe here for the night." Rowena nodded slowly, her heavy eyelids drooping with exhaustion. She reached down to adjust the blankets around Thomas. As she shifted her immense weight, her foot brushed against her soaked leather satchel. The worn leather buckle gave way. the heavy bag tipped over upon the wooden floorboards. A tightly folded piece of thick parchment tumbled out, sliding across the wood until it stopped at the tip of the worn leather boot belonging to the timberman. Gideon knelt. His large fingers picked up the damp paper. He unfolded the sheet carefully, tilting it toward the flickering light of the hearth. It was a bounty poster. Staring back at him was a crude sketch of the towering woman currently sitting by his fire. The bold black letters beneath the drawing declared her a highly dangerous fugitive, wanted for kidnapping and grand theft, offering a massive reward for her immediate capture. The stoic giant stared at the damp parchment. He looked from the crude ink drawing of the supposed monster to the fiercely protective mother, who was currently brushing a stray lock of wild blonde hair away from the face of her sleeping child. Gideon did not see a dangerous thief. He saw a desperate survivor pushed to the very edge of the earth. He carefully folded the bounty poster, pressing the creases flat with his thick thumb, and slipped the heavy paper deep inside the leather pocket of his vest. The mountain morning broke with a quiet, blinding clarity. The violent storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind the sharp, biting scent of crushed pine needles and damp earth. Sunlight poured through the cabin window, resting gently upon the massive frame of the sleeping woman. Rowena awoke before the sun fully breached the jagged peaks. She moved with quiet grace, her towering form slipping silently from the cabin while Thomas continued to rest by the warm hearth. Gideon was already in the yard. He stood beside a massive pile of freshly felled timber, gripping a long iron PV hook. He prepared to roll a colossal pine trunk toward the saw carriage. It was the work of 3 normal men, a grueling task he usually managed entirely alone through sheer stubborn endurance and raw physical power. A shadow fell over the damp sawdust beside him. Rowena stood tall in the crisp morning air. She had rolled the sleeves of her dark red dress high above her massive biceps. The heavy fabric strained across her broad, heavily muscled shoulders. She did not ask for permission. She simply stepped forward, planting her heavy leather boots deep into the wood shavings. "I will not eat the food of another without paying my due." Her voice was steady, vibrating with an unbreakable sense of dignity. "Point me toward the heavy work." Gideon paused. He studied the fierce determination burning within her tired, beautiful eyes. He gave a single, firm nod. They worked in absolute silence. The rhythm of the timber mill demanded perfect synchronization, and the towering mother fell into step with the colossal woodsman flawlessly. When Gideon drove his iron hook deep into the bark of a massive log, Rowena stepped to the opposite end. She wrapped her massive calloused hands around the rough timber. She braced her heavy thighs, dropping her weight low, and pulled. The sheer physical power radiating from her frame was a marvel to behold. Thick, rolling muscles leaped beneath her sun-bronzed skin as she lifted her end of the massive tree. She did not complain. She did not falter. Sweat beaded upon her brow, mixing with the wild dust of the mill, yet she pushed harder. She was working for her keep. But more than that, she was working to prove her humanity. She was shedding the monstrous label forced upon her by her cruel in-laws, reclaiming her worth with every brutal, agonizing lift. Gideon watched her with silent, profound admiration. He had lived his entire life surrounded by rough frontier men who boasted loudly of their strength, yet none possessed the quiet, enduring fortitude of the giant woman beside him. He noted the way she moved, powerful and deliberate, never wasting an ounce of energy. When a particular log proved too heavy even for her immense strength, Gideon stepped close. Their broad shoulders brushed. They pushed together, a unified wall of muscle and bone moving against the unyielding wood. There was a deep, unspoken language passing between them. With every shared burden, the heavy walls of suspicion began to crumble. Trust was not built through pretty words for these 2 giants. It was forged in the dirt, the sawdust, and the shared strain of honest, back-breaking labor. By midday, they had cleared the entire yard, moving a small mountain of timber that would have taken a seasoned crew days to accomplish. Rowena wiped a heavy smear of dirt from her forehead, her chest heaving heavily. Gideon offered her a battered tin canteen. "You have the strength of the mountain." The deep rumble of his voice carried genuine, quiet reverence. Rowena accepted the water. A soft, weary smile touched her resolute features. For the first time in months, someone had looked at her massive size and seen immense value rather than a grotesque abnormality. The sanctuary of this isolated mill felt like a healing balm upon her battered soul. The sun began to dip below the timberline, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley. They walked side by side back toward the cabin, the heavy silence between them now feeling comfortable, safe, and deeply grounded. Rowena pushed the heavy oak door open, expecting to see her son waiting by the fire. "Thomas, we have finished for the day." There was no joyful reply. A terrible scraping sound echoed from the dark corner of the room. It was a deep, wet, rattling cough. Rowena dropped the tin canteen. It clattered against the wooden floorboards, water spilling everywhere. She rushed to the bearskin rug, her heart hammering against her ribs in absolute terror. Young Thomas lay curled into a tight ball. His small body convulsed violently with another horrific coughing fit. His pale face burned with an unnatural, furious heat, and his tiny hands grasped at his chest. Every breath he took sounded like crushed glass tearing through his fragile lungs. The massive woman dropped to her heavy knees, gathering the trembling boy into her thick, powerful arms. She pressed the tiny, burning face of her son against her broad chest, rocking him back and forth. Gideon moved swiftly. He knelt upon the wooden floorboards beside the bearskin rug, placing his large, calloused hand against the burning forehead of the child. The stoic timberman closed his eyes, and a profound shadow crossed his weathered, sun-bronzed face. He knew this sound. He knew the terrible, wet rattle echoing deep inside the fragile lungs. It was the heavy mountain sickness. It was the very same cruel illness that had stolen away the family belonging to him many long winters ago, leaving him utterly alone in the silent woods. He stood up. His towering frame radiated absolute, unbreakable resolve. "I will bring the physician from the valley." The deep gravel of his voice offered no room for argument. Rowena looked up in pure horror, her long, slightly messy blonde hair falling across her tear-stained face. The mountain pass is a river of mud. Her voice broke, thick with rising panic. The storm washed away the main trail. "The dark will drag your horse into the black ravine. You cannot make such a journey tonight. It is certain death." Gideon pulled his heavy leather coat over his broad, muscular shoulders. He reached for a thick iron lantern resting upon the mantel. "I will not watch another child slip away into the dark." He turned to face the giant, muscular mother. "Keep the fire burning. Boil the water. Do not let him fall into a deep sleep." He reached toward the corner of the room, lifting a heavy, repeating rifle. He held the weapon out toward the towering woman. She took the cold iron, her massive biceps trembling not from weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of his sacrifice. This man, a stranger who owed her absolutely nothing, was willing to ride into a death trap just to save the son of a hunted fugitive. Rowena stared into the sharp, observant eyes of the quiet woodsman. For the very first time in her difficult life, she felt a profound, enveloping sense of emotional safety. The cruel world outside had only ever viewed her massive form as a beast of burden, a grotesque oddity meant to be worked or mocked. Yet this stoic giant saw a desperate mother, and he was risking his very life to shield her. Gideon turned and stepped out into the freezing black night. A moment later, the frantic thunder of heavy hooves echoed across the muddy yard, fading rapidly into the howling wind of the treacherous mountain pass. The night stretched into a terrifying eternity. Rowena sat upon the floorboards, wiping the burning brow of her son with a damp cloth. She listened to the agonizing, shallow breaths rattling within his small chest. The cabin was utterly silent save for the crackle of the hearth and the ragged wheezing of the boy. She clutched the heavy rifle across her thick thighs, praying to the silent heavens for the safe return of the honorable timberman. She realized with a sudden and quiet clarity that she no longer just admired the colossal man. A deep, heavy attachment had taken root within her battered soul. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the jagged peaks. A thick, heavy mist rolled through the silent timber yard. Thomas had fallen into a restless, feverish slumber. His breathing was terribly shallow. Rowena stood up, her massive frame stiff from the long vigil. She carried the heavy repeating rifle to the window, peering through the frosted glass. She prayed to see the weathered cowboy hat belonging to Gideon, accompanied by the black carriage of the town doctor. The distant, rhythmic splashing of heavy hooves echoed up the mountain trail. Rowena pressed her large hand against the cold glass, wiping away the condensation. Her heart leaped with sudden hope. The hope died instantly. 4 figures emerged from the thick morning mist. They were not riding the sturdy workhorses of the frontier. They rode elegant, high-bred thoroughbreds, completely unsuited for the mountain mud. The men wore immaculate dark suits and expensive woolen overcoats. Rowena stopped breathing. The cold iron of the rifle slipped in her sweating palms. Hanging from the leather saddlebags of the lead rider was a silver crest molded into the shape of a soaring hawk. It was the undeniable sigil belonging to the wealthy, powerful family of her deceased husband. The cruel men who sought to strip her of her child had finally tracked them to the edge of the world. The riders halted their mounts in the center of the muddy yard, staring directly at the front door of the solitary cabin. They began to dismount, unbuttoning their expensive coats to reveal heavy iron revolvers strapped to their waists. The heavy oak door groaned as the lead rider pushed it open without bothering to knock. Rowena stood perfectly still in the center of the room, her massive frame deliberately shielding the sick child resting upon the bearskin rug. She held the heavy repeating rifle across her broad, heavily muscled chest, her thick arms locked in absolute defiance. The man leading the group brushed the damp mountain mist from his expensive woolen coat. He looked at the towering, wildly muscular woman with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Put the firearm away, Rowena. We are not here for the violent struggle. We are here for the boy," the cruel agent sneered, his cold eyes scanning the rustic interior of the timber cabin. "You will not touch him," Rowena growled, the deep cadence of her voice shaking the floorboards beneath their boots. The man stepped closer, his polished leather footwear clicking sharply against the rough wood. He glanced over her massive, heavily developed shoulder toward the warm hearth. He heard the terrible, wet, rattling cough echoing from the tiny boy shivering upon the rug. "Listen to that awful sound," the agent murmured, a twisted, triumphant smile forming upon his thin lips. "He is drowning in his own lungs. You drag him into the freezing wilderness, forcing him to sleep in the dirt like a feral beast. This is exactly the miserable fate the magistrate predicted when you stole him away." Rowena tightened her calloused grip upon the cold iron of the heavy rifle. Her massive heart hammered frantically against her ribs. "I am his mother. I provide for him," she breathed heavily, the raw, agonizing desperation bleeding through her fierce exterior. "You provide nothing but continuous misery and slow death." The elegant man countered, his tone smooth and lethally calm. "Look at yourself. You are a giant hulking anomaly. You belong in a labor camp, pulling heavy plows alongside the draft horses. You do not belong in a civilized parlor. You cannot provide him with proper medicine. You cannot provide him with an education. You cannot even give him a warm bed. If you selfishly keep him, he will perish before the sun completely sets." The vicious words struck the deeply compassionate mother like a physical blow. The crushing weight of her own personal insecurities, the terrible lies society had fed her for years about her massive size and lack of feminine worth, rose up to completely suffocate her. The agent reached into his coat, pulling forward a thickly folded legal document. "We have a private physician waiting at the luxury estate in the valley. We have a heated carriage waiting at the bottom of the pass. Surrender the boy to his rightful wealthy family right now, and he lives a life of absolute privilege, endless wealth, and perfect health. If you refuse, we will ride back to the settlement. We will return with 50 armed men, arrest you for kidnapping, throw you into a stone cell, and take him anyway. But by then, the child will be dead." The terrible, agonizing silence of the cabin was broken only by another horrific, shuddering breath escaping the fragile lungs of young Thomas. Rowena slowly lowered the heavy repeating rifle. The cold iron clattered loudly against the wooden floorboards. The immense physical power that allowed her to effortlessly move massive timber logs and hold back the fury of a storm entirely vanished, replaced by a devastating, hollow vulnerability. She was a physical giant, but against the cruel machinery of wealth and the fragile mortality of her own beloved child, she was utterly powerless. She looked at the pale, burning face of her precious son. The deep, heavy attachment she felt for him was the only pure, beautiful thing in her harsh life. Yet, to save his life, she believed she had to break her own heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. She believed the cruel lies of the men. She believed her wild, rugged exterior truly made her a monster, completely unworthy of raising a delicate child. Take him. The tragic words tore through her throat, escaping as a ragged whisper of absolute defeat. Take him to the physician. Do not let my boy die. The agent smirked with dark satisfaction, adjusting his immaculate collar. Pack the meager belongings he possesses. Be quick about it. We do not have time to waste breathing the foul air in this filthy hovel. Rowena turned away, her broad shoulders collapsing inward. Tears streamed freely down her sun-bronzed, dust-covered face. Her massive back shook with silent, uncontrollable sobs as she knelt upon the wood beside her small leather satchel. She gently folded the single spare shirt belonging to Thomas, her massive, calloused fingers trembling violently. She was making the ultimate tragic sacrifice, willfully giving up the only profound love she had ever known to ensure his survival. The sound of heavy, frantic hooves suddenly thundered outside the cabin window. The front door smashed open, hitting the interior timber wall with tremendous force. Gideon filled the doorway, his colossal frame radiating pure, terrifying authority. The stoic timberman was covered in freezing mud, his broad chest heaving, his sharp eyes blazing like a furious mountain wildfire. Standing right behind him, panting heavily, was the frantic town doctor, clutching a black leather medical bag. Gideon looked at the elegant, intruding men standing inside his home. Then his observant gaze fell upon the towering woman kneeling upon the floorboards, packing a small bag while weeping in total surrender. The colossal timberman stepped fully into the room. He did not ask what was happening. The scene painted a complete, agonizing picture. The elegant men stood with mocking smiles, while the towering mother knelt upon the floorboards, completely shattered. The lead agent scoffed, adjusting his pristine woolen coat. "Step aside, woodsman. We are conducting legal family business. The giant woman has surrendered the child to us." Gideon moved with the sudden, terrifying speed of a falling redwood. His large, calloused hand clamped completely around the expensive collar belonging to the wealthy agent. The sheer physical power radiating from the stoic protector lifted the elegant man entirely off the wooden floorboards. The feet belonging to the agent kicked helplessly in the air. "Get out of my house!" The deep gravel of his voice was a physical rumble, vibrating with absolute lethal intent. "Take your men, right away!" Gideon threw the man backward through the open doorway. The agent crashed heavily into the freezing mud of the yard. The other 3 men scrambled backward, terrified of the towering mountain of muscle and frontier grit. "You will regret this." The lead agent spat from the mud, pulling himself up by the reins of his thoroughbred horse. We will return!" Gideon slammed the heavy oak timber shut, throwing the thick iron bolt into place. He turned immediately toward the frightened doctor shivering near the entrance. "Save the boy." The physician rushed toward the warm hearth. He knelt upon the bearskin rug, opening his black leather medical bag. He pulled out glass vials and a small metal spoon, gently lifting the burning head of young Thomas. The medicine flowed down the fragile throat of the child. Rowena remained kneeling beside her small leather satchel. Her massive, heavily developed shoulders shook with silent, uncontrollable sobs. She had prepared herself for the end. She still believed the cruel men. Gideon walked slowly across the room. He knelt upon the rough wood beside the towering woman. He reached out, his massive sun-bronzed hand gently covering her own calloused fingers. He physically stopped her from folding the small garment. "He is safe now." The voice belonging to the stoic timberman softened into a warm, gentle breeze. "The physician is here. The medicine is working." Rowena shook her head, heavy tears cutting through the wild dust upon her beautiful, resolute face. They will come back. She wept softly, the raw agony tearing through her gentle soul. They're right. I cannot give him a proper life. Look at me. I am a monster, a freak of nature built for pulling heavy plows and lifting raw timber. I cannot protect him from the sickness. I cannot protect him from the cruelty of the world. I must let them take him away. Gideon moved closer, completely closing the distance between their colossal frames. He looked deeply into her shattered eyes, entirely ignoring the wild, unkempt nature of her blonde hair and the dirt covering her muscular arms. You are no monster, Rowena. The towering man spoke the long, heavy truth he had kept locked inside his chest since the moment she helped him close the barn door. You are the strongest, most fiercely devoted mother I have ever witnessed. You crossed a frozen mountain range to shield your child. You held back the fury of a violent storm. You worked the heavy timber until your hands bled, just to earn your daily bread with absolute dignity. Do not ever let small, cruel men convince you that your massive strength is a burden. It is a magnificent, beautiful gift. Rowena stared at him, her chest heaving. No one had ever spoken to her with such profound, unyielding reverence. No one had ever looked at her massive size and seen true beauty. I have lived alone in these silent woods for many years, Gideon continued, his voice carrying the deep, echoing ache of a lonely lifetime. I believe the harsh winter took my only chance at a real family. I believe my heart was a dead, hollow stump left to rot in the earth. But then you arrived. You brought warmth back into this freezing cabin. You brought a reason to fight back into my empty soul. He reached into the pocket of his leather vest, pulling out the folded bounty poster. He threw the heavy parchment directly into the roaring hearth. The bright flames consumed the cruel lies instantly, turning the paper to dark ash. You do not have to run anymore, Gideon breathed softly, his weathered face filled with absolute, overwhelming vulnerability. You do not have to fight the world completely alone. I offer you my absolute protection. I offer you my name. I offer you this timber mill. I offer you my heart, if you will have a broken, quiet man like me. Stay here. Be my family. Let me stand between you and the cruelty of the world forever. Rowena let out a shuddering, overwhelming breath. The heavy, agonizing walls of despair completely crumbled within her. The deep longing she had felt for safety, for belonging, finally met beautiful, solid reality. She leaned her broad forehead against his muscular shoulder, weeping from profound, healing relief. She wrapped her massive, powerful arms around his broad chest, holding on to the silent protector like an anchor in a raging sea. Across the room, the terrifying, rattling cough belonging to the fragile boy finally ceased. The physician stood up, wiping the sweat from his own brow. The fever is breaking, the doctor murmured softly. The breathing is clear. He will survive. A beautiful, gentle silence blanketed the cabin. The two giants held one another upon the wooden floorboards, their souls knitting together in the warm glow of the fire. But the peace of the mountain was violently shattered just 1 hour later. A loud, chaotic chorus of heavy hooves surrounded the timber mill. It was not just 4 elegant horses this time. It was a massive, thundering posse. The harsh, metallic click of a revolver hammer echoed clearly through the thin window pane. Open the door. The door in the name of the law! A crude, booming voice shouted from the muddy yard. The wealthy agents had returned, and they had brought the corrupt local sheriff and a dozen heavily armed deputies to take the boy by violent force. The heavy fist of the corrupt sheriff pounded against the thick oak timber. Open this door immediately. The harsh demand cut through the chilling mountain air. Inside the cabin, the quiet peace completely shattered. The terrified physician scrambled backward, clutching his medical bag tightly against his chest. Young Thomas slept soundly upon the bearskin rug, finally breathing without pain, blissfully unaware of the danger outside. Gideon rose from the wooden floorboards. His weathered face hardened into a mask of pure, lethal granite. He reached for the heavy repeating rifle resting against the stone hearth. A massive, calloused hand gently closed over the cold iron barrel. Gideon looked down. Rowena stood beside him. She did not tremble. The heavy, suffocating blanket of shame and worthlessness had completely vanished from her beautiful, resolute features. The profound confession of the stoic timberman had forged an unbreakable armor around her battered soul. She was no longer a hunted fugitive running from shadows. She was a devoted mother, she was deeply loved, and she finally recognized her own immense value. She looked at her powerful, calloused hands, realizing they were not instruments of monstrous ugliness, but tools of sacred protection. We will not hide behind wood and iron. Her voice was a deep, steady river of absolute courage. They called me a beast in the shadows. Let them look upon me in the light of day. Let them see exactly what they are fighting. Gideon stared into her fierce eyes. A profound, swelling pride expanded his broad chest. He loved her quiet resilience, but he was entirely captivated by her sudden, roaring bravery. He lowered the heavy weapon, leaving it resting against the stones. He nodded once, acknowledging her right to fight this battle on her own terms. Together, the two giants walked toward the threshold. Gideon threw open the heavy wooden door. The thick iron hinges groaned into the freezing air. The muddy yard was entirely filled with armed men. The corrupt local sheriff sat upon a massive gray horse, his hand resting menacingly upon the heavy iron revolver strapped to his waist. Behind him, the wealthy agent sneered with arrogant, cruel triumph, flanked by a dozen rough deputies holding coiled ropes and drawn firearms. The horses stomped their hooves, their breath forming thick white clouds in the chilling mist. The sheriff opened his mouth to issue a harsh, booming command. The words completely died in his throat. Gideon stepped out onto the wooden porch. A fraction of a second later, Rowena stepped exactly beside him. They formed a terrifying, magnificent wall of pure muscle and frontier grit. The stoic timberman radiated absolute, unyielding authority. Beside him, the towering mother stood with her broad, heavily muscled shoulders pulled completely back. Her immense physical power was fully exposed beneath the torn sleeves of her dark red dress. She did not slouch. She did not attempt to shrink herself to appear small or harmless to polite society. She embraced the staggering, colossal scale of her own body, planting her heavy leather boots firmly upon the rough planks. The armed deputies instinctively urged their horses backward. The sheer physical dominance of the two giants standing shoulder to shoulder was deeply intimidating. They looked less like easy targets and more like a massive, unbreakable mountain range. You harbor a wanted fugitive, Timberman. The sheriff spat, attempting to regain his lost bravado while his horse shifted nervously in the freezing mud. The wealthy family of her late husband holds the absolute legal claim to the sick boy inside. Hand over the child, or we will take him by violent force and burn this mill to the ground. Gideon crossed his massive arms over his broad chest. He did not speak a single word. He simply stood as an immovable mountain, letting the tense silence convey his lethal promise. Rowena stepped forward, her heavy leather boots thudding loudly against the wooden planks. "You claim my massive size makes me a monster," the voice belonging to the towering mother carried across the yard, vibrating with undeniable, fierce dignity. "You claim my thick hands are entirely unfit to raise a delicate child. You judge my torn dress and the wild dust upon my skin. But these massive shoulders carried my son across a frozen, deadly mountain pass when your elegant carriages refused to travel. These heavy hands held back the fury of a violent storm to keep him warm. I am built of heavy muscle and thick bone because the harsh world requires heavy lifting to survive." The wealthy agents glared at her, completely enraged by her sudden defiance. They were unaccustomed to the poor fighting back. "The boy belongs to our noble bloodline," the lead agent shouted, pointing a trembling gloved finger. "You are nothing but a common, filthy laborer. I am his mother," Rowena countered, her voice ringing with absolute fierce authority. My blood beats in his chest. You abandoned him when the mountain sickness first took hold. You would have let him perish in your pristine cold halls to protect your reputation. I will never surrender him to cowards. The sheriff drew his heavy iron revolver, aiming the weapon directly at the broad chest of the stoic timberman. "Take them!" the corrupt lawman yelled into the mist. Gideon and Rowena moved in perfect, terrifying unison. They stepped down from the wooden porch, walking directly toward the line of armed men. They did not flinch. They did not slow their pace. They were a unified force of raw courage, daring the frightened deputies to pull their triggers. The horses panicked, rearing wildly in the freezing mud. The deputies scrambled to control their mounts, their own courage completely breaking against the absolute shared defiance of the two massive protectors. No man wanted to be the first to engage the colossal woodsman in close combat, nor did they wish to face the wrath of the fiercely protective giant mother. The sheriff struggled to calm his frantic gray horse, his face turning pale with sudden, humiliating fear. He realized a physical fight would result in a horrific, bloody massacre for his own men. "Hold your fire!" the sheriff yelled frantically, holstering his weapon in complete frustration. He glared at the two immovable giants standing powerfully in the freezing mud. "You win the mud today, Timberman," the corrupt lawman sneered, pulling his horse around violently. "But you cannot fight the absolute law of the territory. I'm sending a fast rider to the settlement right now. I will summon the Supreme District Judge. He will hold court in the center of this very timber yard by sunrise tomorrow. He will legally strip you of your parental rights forever, Rowena. And there's no muscle on earth that can stop the stroke of his mighty pen." The sun rose over the jagged mountain peaks, painting the muddy timber yard in a harsh, unforgiving light. The corrupt sheriff had kept his cruel promise. A makeshift courtroom now occupied the open space where massive pine logs usually rested. A heavy oak table sat squarely in the center of the sawdust. Behind it sat the Supreme District Judge, a stern, aging man wearing heavy black robes. Dozens of townspeople from the valley below had followed the judge up the treacherous mountain pass. They huddled together in the freezing mist, driven by cruel curiosity. They whispered behind their gloved hands, staring at the towering woman standing near the cabin. They had heard the wild rumors of a terrifying giant hiding in the woods, a monstrous woman completely unfit for polite society. The lead agent stood before the judge, proudly smoothing the lapels of his expensive woolen coat. "Look at her, Your Honor," the agent sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the towering mother. "She is a giant, hulking brute. She possesses the wild, unkempt nature of a feral beast pulling a heavy plow. She dragged the fragile, innocent heir of our noble bloodline away from a life of absolute luxury, forcing him to suffer in a freezing, filthy timber camp. She is an abomination of nature, entirely unfit to raise a proper, civilized child. We demand you grant full custody to his rightful, wealthy family this very instant." Rowena stood perfectly still in the freezing mud. She wore her simple dark red dress, the heavy fabric straining across her broad, heavily muscled chest. She did not attempt to hide her massively developed shoulders or her thick, calloused hands. She remembered the profound, healing words spoken by the stoic Timberman by the warm hearth. She faced the cruel judgment of the entire town with absolute, unbroken dignity, refusing to shrink beneath their mocking stares. The judge adjusted his wire spectacles, looking down at the towering woman with severe disapproval. "Do you have anything to say in your own defense, woman?" The deep voice belonging to the magistrate echoed across the silent yard. Before the giant mother could speak a single word, the heavy oak door of the cabin slowly creaked open. The whispering crowd fell into immediate, stunned silence. Young Thomas stepped out onto the wooden porch. The terrible, wet, rattling cough was completely gone. The terrifying fever had broken during the night. The small boy walked slowly but steadily, wearing the clean, simple shirt his mother had carefully folded for him. He walked down the wooden steps, his small boots sinking into the sawdust. He did not look at the elegant, wealthy men who claimed to be his family. He did not look at the stern judge in the heavy black robes. He walked directly through the center of the crowd, making a straight path toward the towering, wildly muscular woman. Thomas reached Rowena. He wrapped his tiny arms entirely around her massive, heavy thigh. He pressed his small face deeply against the dark red fabric of her dress, holding onto her immense strength. "You cannot take my mother away!" The high, clear voice of the fragile child rang beautifully across the quiet timber yard. "She is not a beast. She is the strongest, most wonderful mother in the entire world. She carried me through the dark when I could not walk anymore. She fought the terrible storm to keep me warm. I will never go with the bad men. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment a cruel lie crumbles into dust before a crowd? It is a profound, breathtaking thing. The harsh, judging whispers of the valley townspeople completely ceased. They looked at the staggering, imposing physical size of the woman, and then they looked at the pure, absolute adoration shining in the eyes of the fragile child clinging to her leg. The ugly illusion painted by the wealthy agents shattered instantly. The crowd did not see a grotesque monster standing in the dirt. They saw the very purest, most sacred, unbreakable form of maternal love. A gentle murmur of deep sympathy and awe rippled through the gathered men and women. The Supreme District Judge cleared his throat heavily, shifting uncomfortably in his wooden chair. He looked down at the thick legal documents resting upon his oak table. "The profound affection of the boy is truly moving," the judge murmured, dipping his sharp metal quill into a glass bottle of dark ink. However, the absolute law of this territory demands practical reality above emotional sentiment. The wealthy family possesses the massive financial means to provide immense privilege, proper education, and constant medical care. This rough timber mill cannot offer such civilized security. Therefore, for the ultimate logical welfare of the child, I must grant full legal custody to the noble estate. The lead agent smiled with dark, triumphant satisfaction. Rowena felt her massive heart stop beating in her broad chest. The judge pressed the tip of his inked quill against the thick parchment, preparing to sign the terrible decree that would permanently strip the giant mother of her beloved son. A colossal shadow suddenly fell directly across the heavy oak table. Gideon stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. The stoic timberman moved with terrifying, deliberate purpose. His broad shoulders parted the townspeople like a massive ship cutting through deep water. He reached deep inside the pocket of his thick leather vest. He pulled free a heavy, folded parchment sealed tightly with dark red wax. The colossal woodsman slammed the mysterious document onto the wooden table with tremendous, shaking force, placing it right over the custody decree. The glass ink bottle rattled violently. The stern magistrate flinched backward as the heavy wax seal shattered upon the rough oak table. He adjusted his wire spectacles, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the thick parchment. The silent crowd leaned forward, their breath forming white clouds in the chilling mist. The freezing air hung heavy over the mountain timber yard, waiting for the final judgment. "Did you acquire this document, Timberman?" the judge demanded, his voice entirely devoid of its previous arrogant certainty. The magistrate leaned closer, inspecting the dark red wax. "I purchased this land from the former physician of that very noble estate many long years ago." The deep, commanding voice belonging to Gideon echoed off the towering pines, carrying absolute, unyielding authority. He fled to these isolated mountains to completely escape their boundless cruelty and endless greed. Before he passed into the earth last winter, he entrusted his sworn legal confessions to me, asking me to hold them safe until true justice required their light. "Read the dark ink, Your Honor. Read the absolute, undeniable truth." The judge scanned the heavy black ink, his weathered face drained of all color. The detailed confession outlined years of horrific criminal neglect, massive financial embezzlement, and the deliberate, cruel abuse inflicted by the elegant agents upon the deceased husband of the towering mother. The document proved beyond any shadow of doubt that the wealthy family did not care for the fragile boy. They only desired to steal the massive financial inheritance tied directly to his continued survival. "This is an absolute outrage," the lead agent shouted, stepping forward with sheer panic flashing inside his cold, calculating eyes. "That parchment is a vile, desperate forgery. It bears the official supreme seal of the Territory Medical Board." The judge countered, his tone turning into a lethal, sharp blade. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down upon the rough oak table with tremendous force. "You do not seek the welfare of this innocent child. You seek a fortune built upon innocent blood and wicked lies. I dismiss your fraudulent custody claim entirely. If you and your men do not leave this mountain before the sun touches the highest peak, I will have you bound in heavy iron, arrested, and and thrown into the deepest, darkest stone cell in the entire valley. The corrupt sheriff immediately stepped away from the wealthy men, refusing to tie his own fate to their sudden, humiliating downfall. The elegant agents looked at the furious, disgusted faces of the valley townspeople. Stripped of their cruel power and exposed before the world, the cowardly men scrambled backward. They mounted their expensive thoroughbreds and fled down the muddy mountain pass in complete, absolute disgrace, never to return. The heavy, suffocating shadow that had hunted the giant mother for long, agonizing months finally lifted, dissolving entirely into the freezing mountain breeze. The terrible ordeal was completely over. Rowena let out a profound, shuddering breath. Her massive, heavily developed shoulders dropped as the agonizing weight of constant fear completely vanished from her soul. She looked down at young Thomas. The small boy smiled brightly, completely safe at last, his fragile hands resting gently upon her heavy dress. Gideon walked slowly across the damp sawdust, ignoring the whispering crowd entirely. He stopped directly before the towering woman. The stoic protector reached out his large, calloused hand, gently cupping the sun-bronzed, dust-covered cheek belonging to the fierce mother. His sharp eyes softened into a gaze of absolute, overwhelming devotion. The terrible storm is finally over. His deep voice was a soft, beautiful melody, meant only for her ears. You do not have to run anymore. You are home. Rowena leaned into his warm, rough touch. Pure, radiant joy spilled freely from her beautiful, resolute eyes. In front of the entire stunned valley, the colossal Timberman and the towering mother wrapped their massive, powerful arms around one another. They forged an unbreakable, magnificent union of physical strength and profound emotional healing, proving that they belonged together. The harsh, freezing winter slowly melted into a brilliant, blooming spring, bringing a quiet, profound peace to the solitary mountain mill. The wild, violent trials of the past faded away, replaced by the gentle, steady rhythm of a beautiful new life. Rowena never again felt the cruel, crushing weight of societal prejudice. Within the safe, towering borders of the timber camp, her immense physical power was not viewed as a monstrous abnormality, but as a deeply revered, magnificent gift. She worked the heavy pine logs alongside her stoic husband, their broad shoulders moving in perfect, harmonious unison under the golden mountain sun. They built a massive, sturdy cabin together, expanding their home into a true sanctuary filled with warm laughter, the comforting smell of fresh sawdust, and absolute, enduring emotional safety. She cooked warm, hearty meals by the hearth, completely content in her beautiful reality. Gideon, the quiet woodsman who had entirely surrendered his bruised soul to the freezing woods, found his heart beating with fierce, vibrant life once more. He became a deeply devoted, loving father to young Thomas. The stoic giant spent his evenings teaching the healthy, growing boy how to read the ancient forests, how to track the mountain wildlife, and how to carve small wooden animals by the roaring stone hearth. The heavy, lingering ghosts of his tragic past were entirely washed away by the boundless, fierce love radiating constantly from his giant, beautiful wife. They proved to the harsh, judging world that true dignity is never measured by the delicate nature of a physical form, but by the undeniable, fierce courage living deep inside a compassionate heart. Their profound love became a quiet, enduring legend in the valley below. Whenever the fierce mountain winds howled through the towering pines, the townspeople would look up toward the high peaks and smile. They knew that the colossal timberman and his magnificent giant bride stood together in the wilderness, forever unbroken, forever safe, and entirely whole. It is a powerful reminder that the greatest love often arrives disguised as a weary traveler seeking nothing more than a warm fire and a second chance at life. The story is a work of fiction designed for entertainment and emotional reflection. The characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. The narrative is crafted to comply with family-safe, PG-rated guidelines, focusing on themes of emotional healing, wholesome romance, and personal dignity. No real individuals, groups, or historical figures are depicted.